indicate something immeasurable. And added that nobody knew, but he thought it probably extended to the end of the world.
Speke could see this new lake was large, but he had no idea that it covered an area of 26,500 square miles. More like an inland sea, this is the largest lake in Africa. Water evaporates from the surface, falls on the surrounding mountains, and then drains back into the lake. This continual circulation of water means little is lost to the equatorial sun. The lake holds water like a vast reservoir.
I claim this lake for England and the Crown. And I name her Victoria, after our gracious sovereign.
Speke returned to England ahead of the invalided Burton. Though he had promised to wait, he revealed his great discovery to the world and claimed the glory for himself.
Now, if anyone would like to ask any questions. Sir.
Though his news was greeted with excitement, his lack of detailed information generated some doubts at the Royal Geographical Society.
You have named Victoria. You have not claimed to have actually seen the Nile.
Of course, those who explore the world from their comfortable armchairs are always the first to carp.
I'm very happy to announce that the Council have asked Captain Speke to return within the year to Central Africa in command of a new expedition, whose object is to inspect the actual exit of the Nile from Lake Victoria.
The focus now switched from Lake Tanganyika to Lake Victoria. Speke was joined by a young army captain, James Grant. Grant idolized Speke and was prepared to follow him to the ends of the earth. They navigated from the south of Lake Victoria around the western side in search of an outlet.
The quantity of mosquitoes on the borders of the lake is perfectly marvelous. The bushes and everything growing there are literally covered with them. As I walked along its shores, disturbing the vegetation, they rose in clouds and kept tapping in dozens at a time against my hands and face in the most disagreeable manner.
The lake has an insect population unrivaled anywhere on Earth. An extraordinary event is triggered during the rains by the new moon. Insect larvae are sent from the lake bottom to the surface to emerge as flies. On their way up, they have to run the gauntlet of shoals of greedy fish. Those that make it past the fish emerge at the surface, struggle free of their larval shells, and rise up into the air. There they join others to form vast breeding swarms. In turn, the swarms merge to form immense clouds comprising billions of flies. Drawn by the flies, terns migrate here from Europe and gather in their thousands. unpredictable winds often blow the flies ashore. Although Speke and his party found the flies irritating, they don't bite. They only emerge to mate. The party approached the northern end of Lake Victoria, where Speke expected to find the outflow from the lake, the beginning of the Nile. By this time, Grant was limping badly from an ulcerated leg, but Speke wouldn't wait. He pressed on, leaving Grant bitterly disappointed that he'd been abandoned so near their goal. On the 28th of July, 1862, Speke reached the point where water flowed out of Lake Victoria as a boiling rapid.
The expedition had now performed its functions. And as I had foretold, the lake is the great source of the Holy River.
As far as Speke was concerned, this was the birthplace of the Nile, and he named it Ripon Falls. But in his haste to get there, he had made a mistake. By leaving Grant behind, he had no witness with him who could silence any critics back home.
Speke rejoined Grant and they set off downstream, planning to follow his river to Egypt and prove conclusively that it was the Nile. The tribal wars blocked their route, and so they were forced to leave the river and travel overland to the town of Gondokoro. This diversion was critical, because it meant that Speke could still not prove that the river flowing out of Lake Victoria was the River Nile. By an extraordinary coincidence, they met with another pair of explorers in Gondokoro, a most unlikely couple to chance on in the heart of Africa. Samuel Baker had rescued Florence von Sass from white slave traders and had made her his wife. They too were in search of the source of the Nile, but they were doing it the traditional way, by doggedly traveling upstream. For a year they explored various tributaries of the Nile and finally reached the vast papyrus swamp known as the Sud. This had been an effective barrier to explorers through the ages. But the Bakers had been lucky. Somehow they had navigated the labyrinth of marshy channels in only 40 days. Nevertheless, in Baker's words, they had braved malaria, marshes, mosquitoes, and misery in these swamps.
In Gondokoro, Baker learned that Speke had apparently discovered the source of the Nile at Lake Victoria. Well, of course, Baker was bitterly disappointed, but he was reluctant to give up. Then he heard about a third large lake, still to be explored. So off he went. He hoped that a river as large as the Nile could have more than one source, and that there was still a chance for a share of the glory.
Once forced to travel cross-country, the Bakers soon found the going hard. Florence collapsed with fever. Their baggage animals died and their food supplies failed. For 10 months they suffered terribly. Then in March 1864 they finally found it. The new lake.
The glory of our prize burst suddenly upon me. There, like a sea of quicksilver, lay the grand expanse of water, a boundless horizon on the south and southwest, glittering in the sun. It is impossible to describe the triumph of that moment. My wife, who had followed me so devotedly, stood by my side, pale and exhausted.
Baker named the lake Albert, after Queen Victoria's late consort. Impressed by its size, it took little to convince him that this lake, along with Lake Victoria, was a joint source for the Nile. Now, surely he would share Speke's glory. Anxious to return to England that season, they followed the shoreline north, expecting to sail down the River Nile back to Gondokoro.
But something was troubling Baker. It was the relationship between the two lakes, Victoria and Albert. Which had the higher elevation? Speke's figures suggested it was Victoria. So when Baker found a river flowing into Lake Albert, although I'm sure he wanted to go home, he knew he had to follow the river upstream to find the answer.
Less than 20 miles upstream from Lake Albert, the Bakers had their answer. The elevation readings now made sense, and Baker surmised that Lake Victoria flowed down this river, Speke's Nile, into Lake Albert. Although Baker was mesmerized by the waterfall, something else caught his eye. In the river at the bottom of the falls was a concentration of surprisingly large crocodiles.
I never saw such an extraordinary show of crocodiles. They lay like logs of timber close together, and upon one bank we counted 27. Every basking place was crowded in a similar manner.
Baker's struggle to explore the Nile had left them bone-weary. They were out of provisions, and they were suffering from malaria and other fevers. It's little surprise that they had no stomach for further exploration.
If death were to be the price, at all events, we were at the goal, and we both looked upon death rather as a pleasure, as affording rest. There would be no more suffering, no fever, no long journey before us. The only wish was to lay down the burden.
Far from home in the grip of fever, the African night can play tricks on the mind. A mournful cry. Just a bush baby. These harmless little creatures are doing no more than advertising their territories. In the stillness of the night, they can be heard for over half a mile. The Bakers pushed on, to the place where Speke had been forced to leave the river on his way downstream, establishing once and for all that Lake Victoria and Lake Albert were linked by the river that Speke was convinced was the Nile. Like Speke, the Bakers were held up by the whims of a local king and tribal wars. It took them a further 6 months to reach the safety of Gondokoro, their struggle home turning into an epic on the scale of their outward journey.
The Bakers had confirmed that a river flowed out of Lake Victoria to Lake Albert, and it became generally accepted that this was the Nile. But there were others who thought differently. Lake Tanganyika had still not been ruled out as a possible source, and Dr. David Livingstone, who supported this theory, was asked to resolve the issue. I was 30 years old in 1871 when my newspaper sent me to Africa. I suppose I had something of a reputation for bringing home stories that people wanted to read, and this story was one of the biggest. 5 years earlier, Livingstone had set off for Lake Tanganyika, but almost nothing had been heard of him since. He was lost, somewhere in the dark heart of that frightening continent, and most people presumed him dead. But after 236 of the hardest days I had ever known, I found him.
Dr. Livingstone, I presume?
Yes.
I thank God, Doctor, that I have been permitted to see you.
I feel thankful that I'm here to welcome you.
He was the most extraordinary human being that I ever had the privilege to know. And it's no exaggeration to say that the man changed my life. He was still convinced that Lake Tanganyika would prove to be the source of the Nile. If the lake's outflow headed north into Lake Albert, his theory might yet prove to be correct. I put my considerable resources at his disposal, and together we explored the northern end of Lake Tanganyika. But Livingstone's hopes were dashed when we discovered that the river there flowed into, not out of the lake. On that trip, we never did find the lake's outflow. I had to return home. The world was waiting for news.
You must forgive me if I have not told you before. You have done what few men could do. Far better than some great travelers I've known. I'm very grateful. If I gave you this, and I've nothing else in the world to give, would you consider it as a memento of our leave-taking?
Comrades, prepare them! Higher, 20! Vitu juu, come on, higher! 20! Punda!
Stanley never saw him again. Livingstone died 14 months later. His loyal African servants brought his body back to Zanzibar, and the doctor made his final journey home. Stanley was not yet an explorer like Burton, Speke, or the Bakers. He had arrived in Africa a newspaperman, looking for a story. But there is no doubt that Livingstone had a huge impact on his life.
He had taught me that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character. Standing by Livingstone's coffin, I had realized that it was my duty to continue the work he had begun. The extent of Lake Victoria was still unknown, and Lake Albert, according to Baker, seemed to be equally vast.
Sound advance! Higher!
Stanley had no choice but to circumnavigate and map all three lakes, Victoria, Albert, and Tanganyika. Only then could he finally settle which was the main feeder for the Nile. Stanley bypassed the scientific institutions and persuaded his newspapers to fund this huge enterprise. He set off once more from Zanzibar in 1874, a general at the head of an army of porters.
People who have no conception what such an expedition entails have sometimes called me ruthless, brutal even. But to me, there's only one judgment. Would I accomplish what I set out to do?
He circumnavigated the vast Lake Victoria and was able to confirm that Speke's Ripon Falls was indeed the major outlet.
Speke had now the full glory of having discovered the largest inland sea on the continent of Africa.
With Lake Victoria finally settled, Stanley set off towards Lake Albert, but his route too was blocked by warring tribes. He turned south to Lake Tanganyika to clear up its role in the Nile story.
It was good to know that I was completing Dr. Livingstone's work. After charting Lake Tanganyika, I followed its outflow west, but it proved not to be the Nile. It was a river that fed the Congo, and for 999 days I followed that great river to its mouth in West Africa. The question of the Nile was still not yet fully understood.
later, Stanley found himself heading back towards the Nile. Only this time he approached from the west, through the dense tropical forests of Central Africa.
If lightning severs the crown of a proud tree and lets in the sunlight, then the race for air and light causes a multitude of baby trees to rush upward. They crush and strangle one another until the whole is one impervious bush. Untracked jungle is pitiless terrain to move through. I began with 800 men, but our casualty rate was high and many deserted. I think I came as close as I have ever come to knowing despair on that terrible journey. Not every person has the gift of finding his way in a forest. Within 200 yards, any man would be hard-pressed to find his way back to the place where he started. Sometimes we would cover only 400 yards in an hour. Nevertheless, we pressed on. Now and then, troops of monkeys bounded with prodigious leaps through the branches. Others swung by long tails 100 feet above our heads, and with marvellous agility they hurled their tiny bodies through the air across yawning chasms. Then they rested for an instant to take a last look at our line before burying themselves out of sight in the leaves. Then we hit the marshes. Thick, scum-faced quagmires green with duckweed, into which we sank knee-deep, and the stench from the fetid slough was sickening. The forest could never sustain the needs of so many men, and the people who lived in its depths were suspicious of us, and often would not trade, taking us for Arab slavers. Most of our food, certainly our staple of rice, we had to carry with us. Meat was in short supply. Hunting hippo, crocodiles, buffalo, and elephant proved unsuccessful. Even though an animal may have been only a few feet off on the other side of a bush, it was impossible to obtain a view of it through the impervious mass of vegetation.
Finally, they emerged from the green hell of the forest, near the western edge of Lake Albert. Albert was now known to be much smaller than the Bakers had optimistically drawn on their maps. But Stanley discovered yet another lake, a little further south, which he named Edward, after the Prince of Wales.
It was clear to me now that there was a family of lakes and waterways that must feed the Nile. There was no single source. These lakes created one enormous reservoir system for the Nile. It's no wonder that it's such a great river.
Of course, there remained one final mystery. Where was the water coming from to fill all these lakes?
I saw a peculiar-shaped cloud of a most beautiful silver colour, which assumed the proportions and appearance of a vast mountain covered with snow. It dawned on me that this must be the Ruwenzori. I had discovered the long-lost mountains of the moon.
The mountains of the moon, so called for thousands of years, sit between the humid forests of the Congo Basin and the monsoon lands of East Africa. Ruwenzori, the local name, means rainmaker, and for much of the year they're shrouded in dense mist. No wonder so few white men had ever seen them. The altitude of the mountains attracts clouds from both east and west, and this steady supply of water trickles down on both sides of the range into Edward and Albert, and a third lake, George, feeding the headwaters of the Nile. But these mountains are more than just an interceptor of rain. They contain the final secret of the Nile's steady flow and strength. This world of ice, moss, forest and bog acts as a reservoir, slowly releasing the rain. At the base of the mountains lie enchanted forests. Mosses, liverworts, ferns and lichens carpet the ground and envelop the trees, helping to regulate the release of water. The Ruwenzori's glaciers drip-feed the bogs, which, together with the forests, feed mountain streams, rivers, and the great African lakes. Frozen at some 16,500 feet above sea level, it is the Ruwenzori's glaciers that provide a steady supply for the lakes, that power the Nile on its 4,000-mile journey to Egypt. His African days over, Stanley settled in England. He was elected a Member of Parliament, and in 1899 was knighted.
We had all sought a definitive answer. A bubbling spring or a single lake where we could plant a flag and say, here is the source of the great Nile. But the truth, as it often is, was more complicated. I and all those who'd gone before me, Burton, Speke, the Bakers, Livingstone, we had all done as much as was humanly possible with the resources available to us. We would have to look to future generations for the final answer.
It would take another 100 years of scientific research and discovery, boosted by huge technological advances, before the origins of the Nile were fully understood. Between 10 and 15 million years ago, movements in the Earth's tectonic plates caused a vast plateau to rise in East Africa. It stretched some 600 miles across and to nearly 1 mile high. At this stage, there were no large, well-defined lakes in the region, and certainly no great river flowing north. As the plateau rose, fractures developed along its flanks. These fractures in the Earth's surface form what we now call the African Rift Valley. About 12 million years ago, the mountains of the moon began to rise as a block near the western arm of the rift. And by 8 million years ago, the maturing rift valleys began to collect water. The lakes of George, Edward, and Albert developed, but the water never broke out of these lakes into a permanent major river. Then, less than 1 million years ago, the center of the vast plateau sagged a little. This slight depression began to pond with water and developed into what we now call Lake Victoria. At the end of the last glacial period, when huge quantities of water were released from the retreating ice, a very wet phase in the Earth's climate followed. Over thousands of years, the lakes filled up. And then about 12,500 years ago, an event occurred which was to change the fate of mankind forever. The water in Lake Victoria spilled north.